Hi everyone, my name is Madison and I will be speaking about the asbestos disaster in Libby, Montana. The purpose of this presentation is to give a broad overview of the asbestos disaster that occurred in Libby, Montana, while also examining the populations affected and the overall impacts. Here's a quick overview of what I will be discussing in more detail. I will start with the location of the disaster site, then move on to background and timeline, demographics, epidemiological data, population impacts, and end with aftermath and summary. So this first figure is a map showing the town of Libby in relation to where the mining site was. The gray area with the dots is the town of Libby, and the lighter gray area to the right is the mining site. The site was a bit outside the town, but many of the workers traveled to the mine from Libby. The top map in the left corner shows where the town of Libby is. It is in the northwest corner of the state of Montana, and the population of Libby as of 2023 was 3,169 residents, so it is a very small community. So here I'm just going to go over some background information on the disaster with a timeline of events. So in 1919, companies began mining vermiculite in Libby. Vermiculite is a naturally occurring mineral with heat-resistant properties. Vermiculite and asbestos actually form under very similar conditions. The two minerals sometimes develop alongside each other, and asbestos contaminated Libby's vermiculite deposit. Libby vermiculite, also known commercially as zonolite, was used in a variety of construction materials, including insulation for homes and buildings. Decades of mining exposed workers and residents of Libby to asbestos. In 1963, W.R. Grayson Company took over the mining operations. They knew that vermiculite was contaminated with asbestos and the associated risks, yet chose not to warn their employees. Mining continued all the way until 1990, when operations were finally stopped. In 1999, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper ran a series of articles about Libby, and it gained national attention. In 2000, the EPA stepped in and began to clean up the town. In 2002, it became a Superfund site. In 2009, the EPA declared a public health emergency in Libby and called it the worst case of industrial poisoning of a community in U.S. history. It was the first and only time the agency announced a public health emergency, which provided extra funding for healthcare for the residents. Here we have a representation of the percentage of asbestos-related deaths by gender. So this data is from 1979 to 2011 from a study published in 2016. Some may assume that it would impact men significantly more than women since men were in the mines, but this just shows a good representation of how far-reaching the impacts were. In terms of asbestos-related deaths, 41% were women and 59% were men. So here's a graph that shows the different age groups impacted and how asbestos-related illnesses can manifest and present at different times of the life course. This is a representation of the asbestos-related deaths by age for both men and women. Asbestos-related deaths were 11% of those aged 85 and older, 29% aged 75 to 84, 36% aged 65 to 74, 23% aged 45 to 64, and only 1% aged 25 to 44, and there were 0% of the deaths in residents in the under 25 age range. So here's a table of the standard mortality ratios based on observed and expected cases of death, including all causes, all cancers, mesothelioma, and asbestosis. Just by glancing at this table quickly, you can see that the observed cases for all causes of death in Libby are much higher than expected, specifically mesothelioma and asbestosis. In Libby, mesothelioma and asbestosis are occurring at an enormously higher rate than should be expected in other towns, matching the knowledge of what we know occurred in Libby. So here we have a graphical representation of the levels of asbestos exposure measured in fibers per cc year in relation to the cause of death for residents of Libby. This data is based on 1,672 white men who worked in the mines hired between 1935 and 1981. You can see that for all deaths, lung cancer deaths, and mesothelioma deaths, there are similar levels of asbestos exposure in the over 1 year exposure group. However, in those who died of asbestosis and were exposed over a year, it is almost double the level of the others. And unsurprisingly, the group of exposure of less than 1 year and who died of these causes had very little asbestos exposure, and very few who were exposed under a year actually died of these causes. Here we just have a line graph of the population of Libby. I just wanted to include this to show how much of an impact the contamination had on this small community. The population is shown to be increasing steadily from 1940 until about 1970. In 1970, we see a sharp decline and doesn't really level off until about 1990. The population never recovers to the peak 1970 population. It can be speculated that it took a few decades for the impacts of the asbestos contamination to be seen at a larger scale. So just to go over the aftermath, the disaster was responsible for the death of 694 Libby residents. Currently, at least 1 in 10 Libby residents has an asbestos-related illness. There are approximately 2,400 Libby residents who have developed an asbestos-related illness since the contamination began. The cleanup is ongoing, and it's the largest and longest-running cleanup of asbestos in American history. And W.R. Grace was ordered to provide $250 million to cover cleanup costs. So here's just a quick summary of what I discussed. So mining for vermiculite began in Libby in 1919. The risks were known to the company, but they did not disclose them to the workers. Exposure was responsible for thousands of cases of asbestos-related illness and 694 deaths. Many different demographic groups were actually affected by this contamination, and there are still long-lasting impacts on the community. This just overall highlights the need for transparency of dangers from companies to their workers.